Sharon. Good afternoon, everyone.
And hello, everybody. I'm Robert Breitbart, Director of Educational Partnerships with Burlington English. And gosh, Sharon reminded me, this is years and years and years of collaborating. And thank you so much. We're so thrilled to sponsor today's webinar. Thanks to COABE and everything you do, Sharon, to bring us fantastic presenters and topics like this. And particularly for this one, we're so thrilled because obviously helping our adult education learners be ready for the community, be ready for the workforce is something that we think is should be top of mind for everyone. And that's the reason you're joining today, I'm sure, as well. And so we help learners get started from the very beginning. So we're totally aligned to the North Star digital literacy standards. We cover all the basics so that you can have your learners learning on site, at a distance, and a combination of all three. We also offer what we know is more than just digital literacy, but true digital skills. And that means being able to interact in a successful way with resources. So not just learning how to use email, but putting the W in WIOA. So having an email here communicating to one's supervisor about safety issues. So we really do things in context. That includes, of course, speaking of putting the W in WIOA, how to find a job. So that the entire career search process we cover in Burlington English. So again, digital skills, but in a real context. So with that, hope you enjoy this fantastic webinar and hope to see you at burlingtonenglish.com/contact for more information. And back over to our fantastic panelists now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robert. And for those of you who've been in our field for any length of time, you know Robert Breitbart well. And Burlington English, they've been a fabulous partner for COABE for well over 7 years now. So Robert, I am going to go ahead and share my screen. If you'll give me the screen back. Yep, perfect. And we're going to dive right into our slideshow here today in our presentation. Ensuring your program benefits from $770 million in federal digital equity funds to states and territories. How to get ready now. And I'm very excited to introduce Janelle Leonard, who is going to be our moderator for today. She's going to introduce our panel and then pass it back to me. And I will go ahead and move forward with a few slides from there. So Janelle, if you'd like to go ahead and introduce our panel.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. Thank you for taking your time out today to participate in this webinar. I'd like to introduce our panelists, Sarah Wheeler, State Director, New Hampshire, Bob McGoffin, NCDE, National Collaborative for Digital Equity, John Winsenhauer at Shelby, and also back to Sharon.
Great, thank you so much, Janelle, I appreciate that. So today, our goals. We have outlined them below, and we want to encourage you to take notes, ask lots of questions, and then share it out on social media. But first, be sure to post your questions to the Q&A and put your chat in the chat box. And we would love for you to share in the chat box your name, your state, and even your program that you're joining us from. This session will be recorded, and a certificate will be shared within 24 hours after the session. So today, we hope to orient your participants to federal funding. We hope to brief you on the federal funding that's expanding affordable broadband access in previously underserved areas and ensure you know how to apply for those funds. First, a little bit about COABE's effort. So as you're likely aware, COABE has been engaging in a national digital equity campaign now for years. We have the Digital Change Agent Network. We have digital equity resources on our webpage. We have been engaging in digital equity webinars and pre-conferences that have served thousands. We had a digital equity panel at the COABE 2024 session, a general session in Nashville. We celebrate Digital Equity Week and we pour resources and time and programming into that with social media campaign and all sorts of things that we do. Digital Equity Journal. We had just participated in the Digital Equity Institute through the American Association for Community Colleges and Universities. And then, of course, we are engaging in a number of digital equity partnerships, one of which is a National Collaborative for Digital Equity. So very excited about that. You all are probably aware that we have a digital equity survey out, and right now we have some kind of mid-year findings. The first is that 40% of local programs reported uncertainty or inadequacy in digital literacy equipment, and only 19% of respondents reported employing digital navigators. So we saw this as really concerning for obvious reasons. And then we also have some information from the adult learner space. 50% reported lack of remote learning devices and Wi-Fi, and they reported connectivity issues with an emphasis on needing resource awareness and partnerships. So we really take this personally at COABE. We're looking for ways to help the field and to bring resources to the field. So with that, I'm now going to turn this over to Dr. Robert McLaughlin.
Janelle, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, my video and sound are not working. They can't hear me. You're gonna have to give my remarks. Just do the best you can.
Oh, okay. So Sharon, Bob isn't his audio and video are not working. And so he asked me to share his remarks with you. So in terms of the federal funding that is available, one, there are two programs that exist, and it's the Digital Equity Capacity Grant. Well, let's start with the digital equity plans. Each state had to submit a digital equity plan that would address the challenges and the barriers that exist in the state. And so those plans were submitted March 28th, and all those plans have been approved. So with that, the next step is the Digital Equity Capacity Grant. And under the Digital Equity Capacity Grant, each state gets a formula-based award. And it could range anywhere from, for instance, the District of Columbia getting 4 million to California receiving about 25 million to implement their state plan. So under that digital equity capacity grant, states have an opportunity to issue RFPs so that those RFPs could be providers for implementing the services that have been designated under the digital equity plan. Services like affordable devices, also digital literacy training, emphasis on cybersecurity, those kinds of projects. So one of the things that we would suggest here is that you access your state digital literacy plan to see what their particular focuses are on. The other project or grant program that is identified under the state equity plan, under the Digital Equity Act, let me just say that, is the opportunity to apply for a competitive grant. And under that competitive grant, we know that eventually, probably in the next 2 to 3 months, that a notice of funding opportunity will be released, and we'll be making you aware of that information. And under that, you can apply as a nonprofit for a competitive grant that would extend what was offered under the capacity grant. It can't duplicate that, but it can extend any services or activities or programs or initiatives that would address the covered population. And I didn't speak to the fact that the digital capacity grant also speaks to something that cuts across all of the Digital Equity Act, and that it speaks to the covered population. And under the covered population, you have people with disability, you have veterans, you have households, low-income households. You also have incarcerated individuals. There are 8 categories specifically that are considered the covered population. And with that, Bob, I hope I did you justice. in terms of explaining this slide. So the next slide here has to do with how much funding is available. And so it's 770 million in total. And that's divided into three sections. One was the development of the State Digital Equity Plan. The other was the capacity grants that are currently that the states are currently working on, and the other part of money has to do with the competitive grant program. Okay. Okay, so the timeline here for the capacity grant was the NOFO was issued March 28th. And so most states are in the process of developing their proposals for the capacity grant. And the capacity grant is the states have to submit that to the Department of Commerce. I think that's one thing that I failed to mention, that this grant program is coming out of the Department of Commerce. And so the states have to submit their proposals to the NTIA within the Department of Commerce by May 25th. And at that point, the awards will be the awards to the state to implement the capacity grant will be issued according to the NOFO no later than August the 28th. Then there's the funding, in October, the funding is for a 3-year period as we know it. We are expecting to get more details and more explanation as to how that funding will be awarded annually. So the next timeline has to do with the competitive grant. And based on the statute, we understand that the NOFO, the Notice of Funding Opportunity for the competitive grant, will be issued 30 days after the Department of Commerce awards funding for the capacity grant. And we're anticipating that the date for submitting those competitive grants will be in December. None of this is definitive now. We're basing our information on the webinars that we've participated in, as well as the statute, as well as what the statute says. And then we're estimating that the funding will be awarded for those capacity grants, which are 5-year grants, in February. The thing that we've heard through the webinars is that the Department of Commerce anticipates receiving about 500 competitive grants, but perhaps awarding up to 100 competitive grants. Now I'd like to turn it over to John Winhauser. So John, would you briefly introduce yourself? You're muted.
Let's try again. Thank you, Janelle. I appreciate you turning the microphone over to me. You did a great job of summarizing the situation. I'm going to provide just a little bit more background about some of the deployment projects that are sort of the foundation for the Digital Equity Act. But just a minute about my background. I'm the executive director of the Schools, Health, and Libraries Broadband Coalition, or Shelby Coalition. You can find information about us at shlb.org. And the Shelby Coalition focuses on trying to solve the digital divide through the lens of the anchor institutions. So we try to be a voice for the schools, libraries, healthcare providers in obtaining very high quality, high capacity broadband, not just to the building, not just to the institution, but also, as we say, to and through the building as a way to reach the residential consumer. So we very much support solving the digital divide. We focus a little bit more on the deployment side of things, but we're totally supportive of the Digital Equity Act and believe that everybody should have a high quality and affordable broadband connection. So I've been asked to provide just a little bit of background about the BEAD program and the Capital Projects Fund. So let me try to address that. So Congress, when it looked at this during the pandemic, it had foresight and said, we need money to build out these networks, but then we also need money to help promote broadband adoption. Once these networks are built, we want to help make them sustainable. So we want people to be able to have affordable access to these networks. Things are working a little bit backwards, as I'll explain in just a minute, in how these programs are rolling out. But there is a logic behind it, and it's important to understand the foundation. So I'll start with the Capital Projects Fund. That was a $10 billion fund. Yes, $10 billion going to the United States Treasury for broadband. And in particular, the Capital Projects Fund, I'll just read you from the description on the website. It's intended to provide money to states, territories, and tribal governments to fund critical capital projects to enable work, education, and health monitoring in response to the public health emergency. So this was a very important program that's actually been rolling out very quickly. In fact, the Department of Treasury has already awarded $9.6 billion of the $10 billion for payments to the state governments and territories to carry on this work. So that's been a successful program so far. Now, not all of these projects have been built yet, but the money has been allocated to the states. And that's a wonderful thing. Most of that money is being used for actually deployment of broadband expenses, but some of that money is also being used for community centers and capital building expenditures in order to promote anchor institutions in those communities. So that's the Capital Projects Fund. The BEAD program is the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program. That's the big, huge motherlode project, $42.5 billion that has been allocated to the Department of Commerce through NTIA. And the BEAD program is intended to build out broadband networks in those rural and hard to reach areas where there's no broadband connectivity at present. So the priorities are to build broadband through the BEAD program to the first priorities to unserved locations, then to underserved locations, and then to anchor institutions in third priority, and then for non-deployment purposes such as digital equity. So the idea is that we want to build out these networks, but the Shelby Coalition, have been successfully making the argument that you shouldn't wait and build out to the anchor institutions at a later point in time. It makes more sense if you're going into a community to build out the network to serve the unserved and underserved homes and the anchor institutions all at the same time, because there are network efficiencies if you build out that network to serve all of those customers in one community. So that process is going more slowly than the Capital Projects Fund. The states have been developing their digital equity plans and their 5-year broadband plans. Those have both been developed by the states, and now NTIA is reviewing those state plans. It's taking a little bit longer than expected to roll out the BEAD funding to deploy these networks. I think we initially thought the funding would start to flow in 2025, and now it looks more likely that the funding will actually start to flow in 2026. So it's going to take a little bit longer than expected to build out those networks, but we are getting there, and the states have been doing a great job of working with their communities to develop those digital equity plans and those state broadband 5-year plans. We know that workforce development is also a big component of this broadband build-out program, and I thought it would be useful to mention that workforce development is an eligible expense for funding in the NTIA BEAD program. In fact, each state broadband office has developed a 5-year plan that needs to include workforce development as a crucial component of those plans. The Fiber Broadband Association projects that there will be a need for 205,000 fiber optic technicians across the nation over the next 5 years to build out these networks. Now, the Fiber Broadband Association has a training program in place, as does TIA. And so there's a lot of work being done, and it's very important because actually the number of telecommunications workforce has declined every year over the last decade, down 23% from 854,000 workers in 2013 to a projected only 656,000 workers in January of 2023. So that workforce development is really critical, that we increase our training to provide the technicians to deploy these networks. Now, the reason I say things are operating just slightly backwards is that the original intention, as I said earlier, was to build out the networks and then to provide digital equity support for communities to get the training to help broadband adoption, to encourage people to subscribe to these new networks. But it's actually working a little bit in the reverse timeline. So we're going to get the Digital Equity Act funding, as Janelle said, later this year and next year, 2024, 2025. Probably the networks won't start to be built until 2026, but that's okay. You know, there are a lot of people who need this help to be able to have the training necessary to sign up for these networks right now. The other thing that's a little bit the opposite of what you might expect is that Janelle said properly that NTIA is going to be awarding the state capacity grants for digital equity over the summer of this year. And then it will turn its attention to the competitive access grants in the fall of this year. But actually, we've heard from some folks that they may actually apply for their competitive grant funding first, because the capacity grant funding is going to the states this summer. And then the states will then have the opportunity to run their own programs to award their money to individual digital equity institutions. So even though the states will get their capacity grant funding first, some of the competitive grant money may be available to institutions earlier than that. And so that's something to keep in mind as you're preparing your applications for this digital equity money. But it's all working. It's all going to be great. And we're making great progress, much more progress than we've ever made before in this country to solving the digital divide. And I'm very encouraged and excited about this opportunity. So thank you for the chance to make some of those comments, and I'll turn it back to you.
So our next speaker, Sarah.
Thanks, Janelle. And thank you, John and Sharon, for having me. My name is Sarah Wheeler. I'm the State Director of Adult Education in New Hampshire. We're a relatively small state, but I've been involved in the digital equity planning in our state for quite some time. And so I'm here to talk to you about the why and the how. And so the why should adult ed be at the table? And the answer is, if we're not at the table, who's going to let our policymakers know what our students need? Adult ed students are included in those covered populations that Janelle referred to earlier that are targeted by this funding. We represent racial and ethnic minorities, seniors, veterans, individuals with disabilities, English language learners, incarcerated individuals, and those who live in rural areas. That's who we work with. That's our adult ed students. In program year 21, according to the National Reporting System data, that equates to 920,567 individuals with barriers to employment who are in adult education programs. Digital literacy skills are essential skills for our adult learners to be successful in supporting their families, their communities, and the workforce. In a recent report from the National Skills Coalition and the Reserve Bank of Atlanta, 92% of jobs in all industries require digital skills. So digital literacy skills are essential skills. Those skills that we teach in adult education open up access not only to the educational opportunities that we have, and the job opportunities through our IET programs and our IELCE programs, as well as solutions for many of the barriers that our students have traditionally faced, such as transportation, childcare, access to healthcare. And so we need to advocate for what our students need. That's why we need to be at the table. All across the country, I hear about adult education programs needing more money. I know that's the case here in New Hampshire. And as Sharon pointed out at the beginning of our meeting today, the initial results of that COABE Digital Equity Survey snapshot, many of our programs have inadequate digital literacy equipment. few of our programs employ digital navigators who can help to implement that digital equity for our students. Our students don't have devices and Wi-Fi to access remote learning. So this is an opportunity to build capacity for the future of our adult education programs without tapping into that limited resources that we receive under Title II. And if our students aren't reason enough, WIOA also includes requirements such as integration of technology in the classroom, teaching digital literacy skills and workforce preparation skills, such as critical thinking and problem solving, the things that our students need to keep themselves safe in this increasingly digital world. Have the next slide, please. So how can adult education get to the table and help with implementing the state digital equity plan? Or compete effectively in the upcoming competitive grants? The first thing is to know what the opportunities are. So knowing that the state capacity grant is happening now. Do you know what's in your state's plan? And if not, you should read it, or at least skim it. Where can you align the activities in that plan with what you do already, or what you could do if you had a little bit more financial support? So all of the state plans are posted on World Education's Transforming Immigrant Digital Equity website. I'll post the link in the chat box after my remarks. You want to be prepared for that competitive grant. So you need to know what's going on in your state grant in order to avoid duplication. Knowing what others in your network are doing so that you're not competing within your own network. I suggest starting with assessing your current programs. What are your programs already doing? Is there something that you can replicate or scale? Having a shovel-ready project, I know it's a construction term, but it applies here. Having a project that's ready to go, ready to roll out. It's helpful because these opportunities are coming fast and you need to have something that's ready to go. Do you have digital navigators? Do you already teach digital literacy skills and cyber safety? Do you have a laptop loaner program or access to affordable devices to purchase for students? Do you offer hotspots, have a partnership with an internet provider for low-cost services? Could those be scaled? What's your current capacity of your local programs? What do they need? What do they want to better address digital equity at the local level? Using and building your networks. Who do you already know? What's going on in your network? Are your partners already tuned into digital equity, or do they need to be? And if not, you could share some of the resources that are already available through COABE, looking at the Digital Equity Champions webinar series. Those are recorded. There's handouts. There's materials that you can use with your partners. If they are connected with digital equity already, what are they planning? And are you a part of that planning process? Not just who do you already know, but who do you need to know? Are you working with your state or your local digital equity alliance or partnership? And if not, find them and reach out. Check for local members of the National Digital Inclusion Alliance, NDIA, or the TIDE website through World Education also has the name of the office that's leading the Digital Equity Act process in your state. Reach out to them and ask them for a meeting. Tell them what adult ed has to offer and how adult ed can help them to meet the requirements of the Digital Equity Act. We teach our students to have an elevator pitch or an elevator speech. Do you have one for yourself? Because you never know who you're going to run into out in the community, but it might be somebody who can help you to get to the table. So making a list of all of the benefits that your students get from gaining digital literacy skills, like access to healthcare, addressing isolation issues, access to education, voter education. Who are the partners that are impacted? Thinking outside of our regular core WIOA partners to community organizations, economic development associations, chambers of commerce, other employer groups, healthcare providers, libraries, and civic organizations. Create a plan. What's your plan? Do you have a short written summary that you can share with a potential stakeholder or funder, or to use as a letter of intent for a competitive application? Because those are coming. Make sure that your plan has all the elements to convince someone that you will use their funding effectively. Adult ed has a long tradition of making a whole lot out of a whole little. And so now's the time to be able to highlight that. Okay. Tell your story, making it short and sweet. What's the problem that your program will address? Share your research. Describe how you'll address that problem. Who are your partners? What are your anticipated outcomes? Having a realistic budget. And making sure to include how that it will be sustained after the grant is gone. One word of caution that I learned very recently is make sure that you're ready to scale your plan. Because I know in our state, we anticipated, based on information that was available at the time, that we get a certain amount of money in for our state capacity grant. And when the actual formula came through, it was significantly lower. And so having a plan, being able to scale it up or scale it down is really helpful, depending on what funding is available. Again, something I think adult educators are pretty well practiced at. Your data collection practices. These federal grants, both the state capacity grant, which will be issued most likely through competitive bidding at the state level, as well as the competitive grant, which is at the national level, will have some pretty heavy reporting requirements. But don't let that scare you. We already do a ton of reporting in the national reporting system. You got this. Adult ed knows how to do this. Think about the reporting that you already do that could be used for these grants. For example, you'll need to track individuals by covered population groups. We already do that with the barriers to employment that we already report. So you'll need to track things like learning progress. We already do that through pre and post testing. Right now, it's for academics of reading, writing, English language acquisition. It may need to be adapted for to measure digital literacy skills, but some of you are doing that already. It's not time to recreate the wheel. Use what you already have. Figure out what data you already collect. Make sure you have some good data quality practices that can be adapted for these grants. Talk to your data folks about what they need if they have to make some changes to an existing system. We have a culture in adult ed of measurable skill gain, of standards-based instruction, of demonstrating outcomes, and all of this makes adult ed competitive. And my last words of wisdom, if they are that, is to be ready. This is going to happen fast. Take the time now so that you're not scrambling when those requests for proposals come out, or those applications come out, or NOFOs, or whatever you call them in your state, and what comes out at the federal level. Find out what the process is for awarding grants in your state through the office who's responsible for that state capacity grant. In New Hampshire, we know that requests for proposals need governor and council approval, and that can take months to get that approval. But we also know what kind of paperwork and justification they're looking for. So we can start pulling that information together and that documentation together ahead of time in order to be prepared. So I encourage you to get some buy-in and support from your state from your state office, from your local providers, from your partners, your students, your community ahead of time, and be ready. Plan, scale, be shovel ready. And back to you, Janelle.
Thanks, Sarah. So I want to thank our panelists for all of the information, the advice, the strategies, the approaches to how to go about learning more information about the Digital Equity Act, as well as the capacity grant, the BEAD program, and the competitive grants. So we are now ready for question and answers. And so Bob and I are going to switch roles here, in that since his system went out, I'm going to pass the baton to Bob so that he can do the question and answer session, as well as add any more comments that we or I may have overlooked, and so share more information with you. So Bob, I'm turning it over to you.
thanks, Janelle. And a bit of irony that you'll all appreciate. I was on the wrong side of the digital divide at the start of this, and my video and audio just weren't behaving. And so I had to reboot a couple of times, and we all know that drill. So thank you for your sense of humor. So a lot of really great questions that we'll get to in just a moment. I did want to add, and this connects to some of the questions, is that to keep in mind that there are two flavors of funding, as just to restate. There's perfect. There's applying to the state. Thank you, Sharon. There's applying to the state because as Janelle was kindly explaining, the states have gotten their state plans approved by the U.S. Department of Commerce. They're now in the process of formally applying for their what's called capacity funding to implement their state plan. And there's a total over 5 years of $1.44 billion coming to states to implement their state plans. And the first tranche of that is $770 million, and that's for the first 3 years. So what's happening? You should know that between now and May 25th, your state broadband office is submitting the forms to Commerce to apply for their share, your state share of its funding under the capacity grant to implement your state plan over the next 3 years. In the next year or so, there'll be another NOFO, a request for proposals for year 4 funding, and a final one for year 5 down the road. But right now, what you should know is, as Janelle was sharing, when states get their capacity funding this fall, and it'll be awarded late summer, early fall to the states, they're going to turn around and we believe with very few, if any exceptions, states are going to take the bulk of their share of that money and design and get approved and issue out to you and others in your state requests for competitive bids to get funded using this capacity funding. So this is still the left side of that slide, right? You're going to apply to your state. The broadband office is going to issue one or more requests for proposals, for example, for digital literacy training, digital navigator training, cyber safety training, right? Those are going to be very common purposes. And one of the reasons why we all thought the leadership at COABE and partners like us who just love what COABE is about and the work that you all do, we wanted to make sure you know this funding is out there, because you ought to have your hands on that soft play. Because even if many adult basic ed programs have not been at the table in developing their state plan, because we know that is the case in a number of states, there has not been sufficient involvement of adult educators in framing a state plan. Nevertheless, you are entitled to apply for this funding, and you are, as you know, an essential food group in growing those skills. Now that's going to be coming over the next several months. Your state broadband office is going to have information for you. We're going to get to that in a question about how do you find out more. We'll get to that in a second. On the other side of this slide, the competitive digital equity funding. This is a separate NOFO, notice the funding opportunity, that's coming out from the U.S. Department of Commerce. Whereas for your state, you're going to go through the state gateway, whatever that process is, like in New York State. For this, on the right side of the slide, for these competitive digital equity grants, you're applying directly to the U.S. Department of Commerce. And that is going to be in response to a notice of funding opportunity that will be posted in the Federal Register, that you'll need to get SAM registered for if you're not already, and apply through grants.gov. These are going to be for 5-year grants. And the NOFO is coming out in the slide that talks about the timing. It's not entirely clear on that slide. Oh, thank you, Sharon. On the right side of the slide, the green ones, you see the question marks there with October for the NOFO, December for the proposal timeline, February 25 question mark. Nobody really knows, and maybe not even necessarily folks at Department of Commerce know these exact timeframes yet, but that's coming. So sometime roughly around these timeframes, the feds are going to issue information about, hey, you're going to have 60 days now to apply for a federal grant through grants.gov, for which you'll need a SAM registration. And hopefully this is making sense so far. Let me also say something that Sarah said, Sarah Wheeler said, that's so helpful and important. For applying to your states, one of your competitive advantages in getting funding through your state broadband office for digital literacy, cyber safety, AI skills, digital navigator training, what have you, one of your competitive advantages is you already gather and report information by covered population. And you even know what that phrase means. That's a competitive advantage. It might not feel like that to you, but it is. And that makes you very attractive, because when you submit a request to get funded to do the kind of work you do anyway around digital literacy, for example, you should make sure you say in your proposal, you know how you already have systems in place to collect information on participation and impacts. Secondly, you also already gather data on learning results. You're used to reporting that for your federal funding. That's going to help you competitively in your state. Okay, those were the things I wanted to mention. Let's go through the questions here through the Q&A. And the first one is, can only nonprofits be eligible for these grants? Well, if you are a hardware, so it's not just nonprofits. Nonprofits are going to get priority for being the lead applicant, but for federal grants, I don't believe that a for-profit can apply for one of the federal competitive grants to the U.S. Department of Commerce, but they could be a partner with you, right? They could be a partner with you. Let's say they're a publisher, or let's say they are a device hardware company, right? They would be eligible as a partner in something for which you or another nonprofit is the lead for in your state. So in some cases, it's going to depend on the request for proposal from your state broadband office as to who's eligible. In most cases, it's going to be a similar situation where the lead applicant's probably going to need to be a nonprofit. But in some cases, they may just go, well, for hardware, we know that maybe for refurbishment, that would go through maybe nonprofits, but for new devices, that's probably going to be on the private sector side. Hopefully that helps. And we'll circle back here and I'll take a breath and we'll ask, does this make sense in a moment here? But I just want to fly through these questions so we can get this and then open this up for the panel on this. In New York State, there was a question about, do we need to be registered in SAM? Not necessarily for your state funding through your state broadband office. They're going to have policy. They'll tell you what to apply for or where you need to be registered. But for the federal ones, yes, you do. And you can't do it too early because it's a bit of a chore, and you're going to want to get SAM registered so that you have a login with grants.gov. And then to whom can you apply? Again, I think we said for the competitive grants, that's through U.S. Department of Commerce. For your state funding, that will be through the state broadband office. For your contact, this is a great question for everyone on the call, that your state broadband office is going to be a really good place for you to find out, hey, do you know when the RFPs are coming out? Do you have a mailing list? And if so, I want to be on it, and don't be shy about that. And in many cases, they'll be grateful to you because they want to get the notice out about funding opportunities. And the link I put here for benton.org has compiled on this page 2 columns on this one web page. One is a relatively recent but not entirely up-to-date synopsis of your state's digital equity plan on the left-hand column, and then for your state, who your contact is in that state broadband office. And that's a good place, and they should become your new best friend in your state, and because they do need your help. And then this question about should you apply alone or with others, I want to refer to to the whole panel on that, and maybe why don't we segue to that and really ask what folks on the panel, if our colleagues' thoughts are about this question of should adult ed programs apply on their own, or should they partner with others? I'd love to see if Sharon, you could help us lead the charge on that, and Sarah as well.
Yes, definitely. I would recommend you definitely want partners. And the more partners, and from my standpoint, the better. Sarah, who is our digital change agent in New Hampshire and also just a fabulous state director, may feel differently. So Sarah, if you want to chime in there.
No, I agree. I think having partners, especially having strong partners, I know that in my situation, and I suspect it's not all that different in other state agencies with adult ed directors, um, doing a federal grant takes a lot of capacity. It takes time, it takes energy. Most of us have very small state offices. If you're looking to do that at the local level, and you may be looking even smaller, and so being able to be competitive, I mean, these are national multi-million-dollar competitions, and the competition is going to be strong. So if you have some really good, strong partners, I think that will definitely help. I think we have a lot to offer. I'm not sure that we're always so great at telling everybody what we have to offer. And so this is an opportunity to do that. And I highly encourage, that applications be submitted. But I would definitely recommend that you work with additional partners, especially ones that might have a little bit more capacity for grant writing pieces, for helping with the data collection piece. Although, again, I think we have some good things in place already for that.
And I can tell you too that on our end, on COIB's side, there are 2 organizations we're currently interviewing to potentially help local programs with the grant writing piece. Just to let you know that. We hope that will be coming out very shortly, but wanted to put that out there because we know that oftentimes the programs that need the funding the most don't have the grant developers to help with the funding. So we really want to add some support there. I also wanted to take a moment to see, John, if you had anything you wanted to add for answering that question about partnership.
Well, I guess I would just add that partnerships, I agree with you, partnerships are going to be really key to putting a grant together and to receiving the approval from either NTIA or the states. They're going to be looking at the breadth of coverage of your digital equity application. So a one-off, hey, I can do this all by myself kind of approach is not likely to win favors with those who are reviewing the application. So the more partners you can gather together, the more likely you'll be successful in getting the grant and also, implementing the grant as well, because then you'll have more people to coordinate with that can spread the message. I will just add one additional point while I have the microphone. So the awkward thing about the timing here is that organizations may have to prepare to apply, prepare applications for the capacity grants and the competitive grants at about the same time. And we don't know exactly for sure when the timing is going to be, which is different from the way this was initially envisioned, because the idea going into this congressional debate was let's get the capacity grant money out first and then allow entities to apply for the competitive grant afterwards to be able to fill in the gaps. But that's not the way the timeline is actually going to work. And it's going to vary from state to state about when the state is going through their RFP and accepting applications for their state capacity grants, and the NTIA digital equity competitive grants may end up happening around the same time. One may go first in one state, the other may go first in another state. So you really need to check with your state schedule and unfortunately try to anticipate what may happen in those other grant proposals so you can prepare your best, have your best shot at winning the grant.
Thank you, John.
This is super. Thanks, Sharon. If it's okay to go to the question of get a seat at the table, and Sarah's posted a really great response there, which I want to segue to in just a moment, Sarah. But just to quickly add, and Sharon, I think you'll resonate with us quite a bit. Well, Sarah too, is that one of our biases, we co-authored New Hampshire State Plan, and we felt that it was only because of our experience and admiration for adult ed that we knew that adult ed needed to be at the table as an essential food group. And many states did not have adult ed at the table. So therefore, one of the wonderful allies are your state affiliates, right? The state adult ed programs, the state adult ed networks. And I say this as a seat at the table because together you might find as a state or national coalition to really advocate with your state broadband offices that they need to have you at the table. And let me say this, that there is supposed to be, under the Digital Equity Act, every state, when they develop their state plan, they're not only supposed to be giving out money over the next 5 years, really, this initial 3 years plus year 4 and year 5, but they're supposed to have in place ongoing mechanisms to hold themselves accountable for, are they moving the needles that matter? You work with all 8 of the covered populations, and you do it fluently. And you already do it with digital literacy, and you do a lot already in digital navigator related ways, and cyber safety and access to broadband, and so many ways that are relevant to this. You can help your state formatively evaluate their progress so that it's not just getting funding, but it's influencing the accountability of your state over the next several years. So you can help have a voice in not only getting funded, but are they helping you get what you need to deliver capacity? Related to that, one quick thing I promised earlier to say, if my device had worked better, is that when you are thinking about what's eligible for funding, in terms of costs, that it's not only delivering training, it could be building your capacity, could be funded. As Sarah, we've talked about in New Hampshire, you could be funded for curriculum development, for staff paid release time to pilot something, evaluate it, revise it, right? It could be for a variety of purposes. It could be to help other institutions develop policies to partner with you. Anything that will build capacity, not only directly deliver service, but improve capacity is fundable. Does that help and make sense? And Sarah, do you want to say some more about seat at the table? Because you've really embodied this.
So, I mean, I think I addressed it in my remarks. I also addressed it in answering the questions. I've been trying to make sure that everybody else's questions in the Q&A box get answered to the best of my ability, because I know there's a lot of questions out there with regard to who's eligible to apply and how they should apply and that sort of thing. So again, if you haven't read your state plan, I highly recommend that you take a look at it. One of the things that I did for my local providers was I took our state plan and then I went through each of the goals and strategies and I said, this is how it might apply in adult education, to give people ideas about how they might be able to implement that. So for example, one of the goals was to build a digital navigator core. It identified 5 or 6 different organizations who might be involved in that. And I said, well, adult ed should be one of those. And so that my adult education program directors could see that and say, okay, well, here's one place where we might be able to make a difference and something that we could do.
Also, Bob, I'd like to piggyback on something Sarah said, but moving the needle forward. There's a question in the Q&A that asks about the status of the Affordable Connectivity Program, and John is our expert on that. And so, John, I'd like to toss that question over to you.
Well, unfortunately, things do not look good for the continuation of the Affordable Connectivity Program, the ACP. There have been several legislative efforts to provide additional funding for that program to keep it going, but those pieces of legislation have not made their way through the system, the congressional system. So the current ACP is expiring this month. In May is the last month. People will get a portion of their ACP subsidy in May, and then will not get anything more starting in June. I could go through more of the legislative vehicles. There's a spectrum bill that would have $7 billion for the ACP. There's also the ACP Extension Act, which would also propose $7 billion, but they're facing some opposition. unfortunately, primarily from some of the Republicans, not all of the Republicans. Some Republicans do support the funding for ACP, but others in the leadership are not supporting it, and so that's been a problem. So we've got to look at other means of continuing that subsidy. And we're trying to find a long-term solution so that we can integrate ACP into the Universal Service Fund in the long run. But that's another topic for another webinar.
And John, I'll chime in and say, COAB has really tried to activate the field, reach out to legislators through our legislative tools that we have available to us. But we've also been looking at partnership with an organization that, while it might not be free, it could be greatly discounted. So we are working on a few different options for the field to try to help them help the adult learners. So I know we are at the top of the hour. We have 2 more minutes here before we close out. Anybody have any last questions you'd like to answer before we head out? We can also go back through the Q&A and send out responses to those that we didn't get to as well. But any last questions we want to answer or last thoughts before we head out?
If you don't mind, I'd like to highlight a comment in the chat box from one of my fellow state directors. Maureen Whalen talked about Delaware having brought together the Department of Labor, Education and Training, Department of Education, CTE, Department of Corrections, I think is DOC, but working together and determining that they would work together and use each other as partners. I think that's a great model. Again, these are partners that we already work with in many situations, both at the state level and at the local workforce level, workforce boards, and even for local providers. So please rely on the partnerships that you've already built.
And Sarah, I think that's a great point to make. Like with the state directors that are taking the initiative, which we had hoped all along, COAB started, I think, 2 years ago when we first heard about this, really encouraging state directors to do this. If you have a state director that is doing this, count yourself very blessed. I would take that's maybe the first step is ask your state director what they've done so far and partner with them. Like Marilyn Pizzulo in Indiana is amazing as well. She's doing great work too. So I say that because for our local programs here, get in touch with your state director first to see what he or she has done, and then go through these next steps that Sarah and team have laid out here. So we're at the top of the hour. I see Robert on. Robert, would you like to close us out?
Just this may be the best and most impactful webinar we've ever been part of. Thank you to all the presenters on this heavy lifting. Thank you, COAB. And I know you say it many times, but please share that this is archived. This webinar is archived. So any colleagues or anybody that you would like to share it with, it's going to be on the COAB webinar page. And thanks for just powerful information. Thank you for all you do.
Thank you, everybody. Any last thoughts, Janelle or John?
No, I'd like to echo what Robert said. It was a lot of information that was covered, and the recording will certainly help, and even the question and answer. So you might not be able to hold it all within your head, but at least you have a tool to go back to and review.
Thank you to our fabulous partners, the National Collaborative for Digital Equity, John Wintenhouse, as well as the Schools, Health, and Libraries Broadband Coalition, and Sarah Wheeler with New Hampshire Department of Education, as well as, of course, I can't forget my pal, Robert Breitbart at Burlington English. Thank you, everybody. Really appreciate you all. Have a wonderful day.
Okay.